basically you get this same pattern with substance use behaviors. People continue to drug seek despite negative consequences. You see it with chronic pain conditions, so patients develop compulsive relief-seeking habits, be it going for opiate meds or lying down on the couch or whatever, or not going out or not doing your job anymore, despite worsening pain, affect, and function, right? And with chronic pain and opiate therapy combined, you get the joy of combining potentially those, doubling the learning on those, so patients can develop these entwined drug-seeking and relief-seeking behaviors, which can be difficult to unravel. So how do we get this compulsive, this punishment-resisted reward-seeking? So I just mentioned we have these medium spiny neurons that are going to choose and trigger our reward behaviors when there's enough dopamine neuron input about how great my reward could be. As I mentioned, there's two subtypes of medium spiny neurons. There's one that's referred to as the direct pathway. Those medium spiny neurons have D1 receptor on them, and they are excited by dopamine. What that means is when there's an opportunity for reward, dopamine gets dumped on those neurons. They push your brain, push the neurons downstream to say, yep, that's great, go reward seek. Go do the thing you need to do in order to get that reward. So that's their job, is to encourage you to go do it. You then also there's another set of neurons in there called the indirect pathway neurons. They have the D2 dopamine receptor, which is just another subtype also, but this receptor subtype is inhibited by dopamine. So when dopamine hits these neurons, those neurons, it slows them down and makes it harder to trigger reward seeking. And I'll show you what this looks like from a neuron level. But basically, when you activate D2 receptors, it increases inhibition on that neuron so that it takes bigger or more sustained input, so bigger opportunities for reward in order to trigger reward seeking. So what does that look like? This is, of course, my pointer doesn't work now. So if you look at the first chart, this is a graph of how neurons work, essentially. The idea is that at that bottom line, that's where neurons kind of sit in a resting state. Kind of think of them as the way neurons get activated is basically ions flow into the neurons that makes the neurons more positively charged. And when they get to a certain threshold, that triggers them to send a message to the next neuron downstream. But you have to get from your starting level to your firing threshold in order to pass any information down the line and trigger the next behavior. So basically, when dopamine input comes into these neurons, these D1 receptor, oh good, it came back. These D1 receptor neurons get activated. They start drifting up till they get to firing threshold. And when you hit that firing threshold, it says, okay, that's when you're going to go do your habit. So what happens with D2 receptors is when the D2 dopamine receptors get activated, they actually inhibit those same neurons. And so what that inhibition does is it drops the starting activation. So it takes more input before those neurons get to the firing threshold. So it makes it harder and takes longer for any opportunity to trigger habit behavior. So your D2 receptors are going to slow your decisions down to reward or relief seek, so you consider other options. And that functionally what that does is it allows for behavioral flexibility. It allows you to make decisions that prioritize long-term goals over short-term benefit of relief. Like this is what lets you choose to not eat the donut because you want to go to yoga class in an hour and it's going to make you sick. That sort of thing. So but without that D2 receptor, what can happen is that firing happens too quickly. So what happens if your dopamine neurons start firing too much? What if you get too much dopamine input into this circuit, right? So if there's too much firing, and by too much, I mean really like abnormally high levels, things that don't happen in everyday life, what you get is those D1 receptor pathways, they get more efficient at activating your medium spiny neurons, so they get up to firing threshold even faster. Plus, they do this nasty little thing where when they get hit too much, well, I guess even whenever they get hit, they encourage the cell to start producing dynorphin. Dynorphin's a kappa opiate peptide, and essentially it causes dysphoria and aversion. It makes you feel sick. And normally, if you have normal everyday input, the levels never build up enough to do much of anything. But if you're getting huge overactivation of this circuit, then the dynorphin builds up and makes you start. It's kind of I think of it as like a satiation response, kind of akin, and maybe in fact the cause, although I don't think anyone's shown this, of like if you think of when you go to Thanksgiving, right, and there's like endless food, when you start eating, everything's wonderful and it's great, and you want to keep eating it, it's so great, and then like half an hour later, you're just like, oh my God, that's good. I don't want to see another piece of pumpkin pie in my life. It's the most disgusting thing ever. That is pretty much what dynorphin's for, right? Too much reward. It's supposed to slow you down and make it not so appealing anymore. So when direct pathway neurons receive excessive dopaminergic input, so they both get really, really, really good at triggering these behaviors, but they also activate these anti-reward pathways like this dynorphin pathway, but also some other stress response pathways that include cortisol releasing factor and the like, which has the net effect of depressing mood. It makes you feel worse over time. You're just not supposed to do that much. You're not supposed to do that much reward seeking in any short period of time, because that's overkill, right? So what happens to your D2 receptors pathway? Normally, right, this D2 receptor activation's great, right? It hits the receptor, inhibits, it's exactly what you want it to do. But if it gets hit with too much dopamine or too much dopamine over time, what happens is it desensitizes and internalizes all the receptors. And I'll give you a picture so this makes a little bit more sense. And that essentially winds up removing the D2 dopamine receptors at all. And the cells become unable to inhibit that activation. So what are we talking about here? So it turns out these receptors, these D2 receptors, are a type of receptor called G protein coupled receptors. They're these little 7 transmembrane domain receptors. They normally sit on the cell, and they have these little G proteins that sit to them that send the signal. The thing you need to know about them is when they bind an agonist, when they bind the opiate, or the dopamine in this case, opiate receptors work just like this too. When they bind the dopamine, the receptor changes its shape, which is what sends the signal, but then it gets stuck, and it can't go back to the way that it was before. The only way for the cell to get that receptor back so it will work again is a process of sort of a recycling process where that receptor gets internalized into the cell. It brings it into these little vesicles where they change the composition. They make it really, really acidic. That reshapes the receptor back to its functional shape, and then it gets shipped back up to the surface. It's not a perfect process, so when they try to recycle, they lose some of it. So it's, over time, it kind of degrades. But what happens is this process takes about an hour, which on neuronal scales is a really long time, right? So if the rate of input, if the dopamine input is so fast that it outpaces the recycling rates and the new receptor generation rate, you wind up with essentially no receptor on the surface, and it can't do anything. And you've now taken the brakes off of your reward circuits so that anything that comes in, any reward opportunity, any opportunity for relief, is going to trigger those habits without enough time for the rest of your brain to weigh in on whether or not that's a good idea. So essentially what you see is when you get these big, huge dopamine inputs, you get really, really fast, efficient D1 pathway activation, and you lose all of that D2 inhibition. So they're no longer starting. You get really, really fast decision making, and you lose the ability for punishment or anything else to weigh in on the decision. So what does this mean? Obviously, we want, in order for this circuit to work functionally, you need D2 input, right? The D2, if you don't activate those D2 receptors at all, then you don't get the inhibition. You're stuck in that impulsive state. But you don't want so much that you blast it all in, you inactivate it all. So you need essentially ongoing low-level dopamine input. And you really want to avoid anything big, anything that overwhelms the system so that the inhibition goes away. Because a big dopamine signal, it might provide some immediate inhibition right away, but then there's nothing there for the next hour to help you with your decision making.
So methamphetamines would influence that?
Yes. Yeah. So one of the things you see, okay, the other piece right here, so just to summarize, the things that you get, right, as you hit these receptors with large dopamine inputs, you're going to not only drive relief seeking, and you're going to activate these anti-reward systems that generate stress response, increase negative affect and aversion over time. And you're going to lose your, if you have slow input, you're going to provide restraint on habits, allow you to think, allow you to make long-term decisions. But if you have these big signals, all of that ability goes away. So what we're aiming for, essentially, to make our system work well, is we need stable, moderate dopamine input, right? So lots of little itty-bitty opportunities for reward, the sorts of everyday rewards that are supposed to make up most of our day, right? Like, I can make you smile, or I might, have a cookie, or I go for a walk and feel energized, or whatever. I have a problem and I figure out a solution for it. All these little things like make my life better, and I need a lot of them, right? My day should have a lot of nice little things happen in there. And that will activate my D2 receptors, allow me to make long-term decisions. And I want to get rid of these big, huge things that wipe off the D2 receptors. So, okay, we already talked about that, so I'm going to skip. So what's been shown is that in addiction, so with substance addiction, one of the main things you see is if you image D2 receptors in addicts, they invariably have incredibly low D2 dopamine receptor levels. Wiped out likely because the drug use itself is so big, it eliminates the receptors. But this interestingly has also been shown with junk food eating. So eating food with concentrated fat levels, sugar, salt, things that are really like just not found in nature. I think of it like the ho-ho effect. Unhealthy junk food, processed stuff, can also cause this over time. Those are big rewards that your brains aren't used to getting. And you can show in rodent models just feeding a rodent junk food for a week even. Like for a short, if you feed a rat junk food for a week, they will then run across an electrified grid to get junk food. And their D2 dopamine receptors are basically wiped away. You can get really fancy because you're working with rats and use viral vectors to upregulate the D2 receptors. So put D2 receptors on rodents that have been trained to eat junk food, and they won't run across the grid anymore. So it's like almost certainly related to the punishment resistant part is almost certainly related to the ability to inhibit these behaviors. So does this have anything to do with chronic pain? Well, Interestingly, people have found that people with chronic back pain have substantially reduced D2 receptors. So if you take people who have back pain that just won't go away, they have reduced D2 receptor expression in their ventral striatum, their nucleus accumbens, and they have less pain-induced dopamine release in the amygdala. So they've been reshaped, they've lost this ability to respond to punishment. How does this maybe occur? Well, what they found is that if you give rats neuropathic pain injury, you go in and purposely damage their nerves. What you find is that causes burst firing of those VTA neurons, the dopamine neurons. You can measure, you look in their nucleus accumbens, they have high extracellular dopamine receptor levels, and they wind up showing, a week later, reduced expression of D2 receptors, but not D1 receptors. So